Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from Smith School of Business. My name is Meredith Dault, and I'm a business journalist at Smith School of Business at Queen's University. It's really great to see you guys rolling in and greeting in the chat. So let's keep that up as we welcome everybody to today's session. I do want to start by acknowledging that Queen's is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We're grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, during which we're going to be learning more about the meta skills required for career success, which is indeed a timely topic for anyone looking to level up their career this year. And as always, today's webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. And it's now my pleasure to introduce today's guest, who is indeed one of our favorites. I'm sure many of you are here because you've seen Dane present before. Dane Jensen is an expert on strategy and leadership. As CEO of Toronto-based Third Factor, he advises CEOs and senior leaders in both business and sports. He also teaches in the full-time and executive MBA programs at Smith. He is the author of The Power of Pressure: Why Pressure Isn't the Problem, It's the Solution, which was published by HarperCollins in 2021. Welcome, Dane.
Thank you so much, Meredith. It is a pleasure to be here, and welcome to everybody. Great to see all of you flooding in on the chat, and it looks like we got people almost from coast to coast, which is great. So really looking forward to the next hour.
All right, I'm going to give you the floor, and I'm going to back away, and I'll come back when you're done, and we'll get to the audience questions. So enjoy.
Awesome. Thank you very, very much. All right. So we are here today. We're going to talk about this whole idea of being future-proof. So the topic of the session today is 6 meta skills for career success. And, the whole idea of being future-proof, at the end of the day, the question that I'm going to try to answer over the next 60 minutes, which I think is sort of the definitive question for anybody who is doing some sort of career planning right now, is in this age of incredible change, incredible transformation, what does it take to be irreplaceable? What does it mean to be irreplaceable? And I think this is a particularly timely moment to be asking this question. I'm sure there are many of you who are familiar with the sort of famous line, Marshall Goldsmith originally coined it, "What got you here won't get you there." And of course, I think that is still true. I think what's a little bit unique to the year 2024 is, I think increasingly what got you here won't even necessarily keep you here. Things are evolving so quickly that at the end of the day, the skills that are needed just to keep the same job are actually shifting quite rapidly. And one of my favorite little pieces of research on this, which was done by a crew from Harvard, headed by Joe Fuller, who's an ex-colleague of mine from the Monitor Group, they took this really interesting approach, which is that they looked at job postings for C-suite roles. So, companies that were doing big searches for CEOs or CFOs or other C-level roles, and they looked at the job descriptions to try to see what are the kinds of skills that companies are recruiting for into those very senior roles. And so you can see, relative to a baseline in the year 2000, job descriptions that mention strength in financial or material management have dropped by close to 40%, while job descriptions that mention strength in social skills like leading others, empathy, emotional intelligence, they have actually gone up by almost 30%. And so when you look at people that are in these very senior roles, most of whom have been promoted because of their functional strengths, strength in finance, strength in supply chain, strength in operations, even just keeping those senior roles increasingly requires that those skills are deprioritized and more attention is paid to some of the other stuff that's becoming increasingly popular. And in this world of rapid change, the argument that I'm going to build over the next 60 minutes is this idea that in a world like the one we live in now, ultimately, evolution is more important than execution. And not that execution isn't important. If you don't execute, that makes for a relatively short career. But over the long haul, this ability that this idea that our ability to evolve trumps our ability to execute when it comes to longevity, when it comes to being truly irreplaceable. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the things that underpin evolution, which is this whole idea of meta skills. Because in my mind, skills are what allow us to execute a role. They're what allow us to be competent in a given role, in a given function. It's meta skills that are the things that allow us to evolve, right? To grow, to change, to be adaptable. So that's the kind of idea. What does it take to be irreplaceable? In my mind, it's about evolution. Evolution is underpinned by meta skills. How do we build them? So I'm going to do three things over the next 40 minutes. The first is I'm going to set the context. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think that meta skills really are the currency of talent, the currency of careers, by looking at what's going on in the world that makes evolution so important. Then we're going to lay out what are the 6 core meta skills. And then finally, we're going to look at how do we build them and how do we scale them in organizations. So that's kind of the flow. And I'm going to kick off this whole idea of why. Why now? Why meta skills? Why is evolution so important? By telling a bit of a story about an organization that I think represents this idea of evolution, of being meta skilled. And that organization is IBM. IBM, which was founded in the early 20th century, for about 70 years of its existence, it did one thing. It built computers. It bent metal to build big machines like the one that you are looking at right now. I mean, that's what the IBM the IBM name stood for, was International Business Machines. And for 70 years, that's what they did. They assembled, designed, and built business machines. And that was a very profitable business for IBM for almost 7 decades. It sustained and built them into one of the biggest technology companies in the world. And then things started to flounder a little bit. Until in the early 80s, IBM was really struggling. And a CEO named Lou Gerstner came in, and he recognized that ultimately the business needed to transform. He had the observation that all of the profits in the industry were migrating from the people who built the machines, which was kind of becoming a commodity. It was like, hey, anybody can bend metal, anybody can make a transistor. All the money was moving towards understanding what to do with all the great data that was coming out of these machines. And so Gerstner really transformed IBM. He sold off all the hardware parts of the business. This is why we have Lenovo ThinkPads now instead of IBM ThinkPads. He acquired a consulting business and ultimately rebranded the business under this moniker of let's build a smarter planet. IBM became a consulting firm, for better or for worse. How do we use the data and the insights that are coming out of the technology? And that was a great business for about 20 to 25 years. And then in the early 2010s, IBM realized they had to reinvent themselves again. The consulting, technology consulting business was starting to get commodified. And so what they started to do is execute a second transformation, this time around cloud and cognitive computing services. Right? And this meant taking things like Watson, which started as a game show novelty, the first computer to beat Ken Jennings on Jeopardy in the early 2010s, to scaling this as a business model. And in fact, if you land on IBM.com now, you can learn about how Watson X can, help create reliable AI workflows. The whole business is oriented around cloud and cognitive computing services. And the thing that I always take away from this IBM story, or at least the question that it always sort of poses for me, is what is it that is going on in the world that has meant that a business that did the same thing very profitably for about 70 years has had to fundamentally reinvent itself twice in the last 35 years, and almost 3 times, depending on how you count the AI revolution that they're in the middle of right now, right? What's happening in the air that went from 70 years in the first incarnation to 25 years in the second incarnation and now 10 years in the third incarnation? And I think there's a lot of different ways you can slice and dice this. There's a lot of different people that are doing trend analysis to try to understand where disruption is coming from and what's accelerating change. So this is not necessarily like the be-all and end-all or the only way of looking at the world. But I want to give you one framework for looking at the world in terms of what is going on that is accelerating the pace of replacement and therefore making evolution more important. And it's my view that there's sort of 4 things that are happening simultaneously that are driving this. The first thing that is happening, the first major source of disruption that is driving the need to evolve, is biological and ecological uncertainty. Right? Just the way in which our planet and the life forms on our planet are changing, are evolving. Of course, we have sort of, the mother or the father of all uncertainties, which is climate change and all the climate disruption and adaptation that comes along with that. At the same time, we have a world that is increasingly moving into urban centers. There is a prevailing global trend towards urbanization. There was a real school of thought that actually that was going to reverse coming out of the pandemic, that once people could work remotely, cities would cease to be as important. People would be able to, move back to where they had more land and space. And that hasn't happened. We've seen, the urbanization trend continue following the pandemic. And then at the same time, in most parts of the world, there was a setback through COVID, but we are seeing this trend towards longer life expectancy, having to plan for people that are living longer lives, that are in career for significantly longer than they were 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So that's one thing that's going on. We have massive uncertainty driving change in the broader biological and ecological environment. The second thing that's going on that is making the world, I think, a little bit more disruptive and faster changing is tremendous geopolitical uncertainty, right? I grew up in the 90s, and in the 90s, it was kind of widely believed and assumed that we were on a one-way trip to a globally connected world, right? That tariffs were going to go away, trade barriers were going to fall, immigration was going to become much more normalized. We were moving to a global economy. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History that argued that the world was on this one-way path to, a global economy rooted in, democracy and capitalism. Well, I think we have seen quite significantly over the past couple of years, that's not necessarily as smooth or as one way of a street as we thought, right? Tariffs are going back up, protectionism is back, we're looking at regional blocks, people are competing a little bit more with each other. And all of that is also happening in a climate of massive polarization. You only have to look at the US election cycle that's kicked off to certainly see that in spades, as well as the rise of populism globally, whether that is, the resurgent right in the United States, Europe. You look at what's going on in Argentina. So a lot of sort of bottom-up populism that's occurring. So that's the second thing that I think is driving a massive amount of disruption and change. The third thing that's happening, and I think this is a little bit underappreciated when it comes to what is driving, the changing needs for organizations and at work, is we are really in the midst of a big change in terms of how humans interact with each other and with the companies that they do business with. There is a massive change in human norms and preferences when it comes to communication and relationships. And the one that I want to say a little bit about, because I think it really changes the way that companies need to operate and therefore the kind of careers that people have in companies, is this idea of a diminished trust and authority. And, diminished trust and authority is not limited to business. We are seeing sort of a breakdown in trust and authority figures across a variety of sectors. So if you look at the trust in, for example, public health authorities, through the COVID crisis, that's one, area in which trust sort of diminished over the past 3 years, trust in government, trust in the media. But for those of us working in businesses and organizations, the same trend is impacting us as well. And one of the more interesting examples that I had of this was I was actually teaching in the MBA, one of the MBA programs at Smith, and I had a guy who ran a hearing aid company in Canada. And we were talking about this, and he told me a bit of a story. He said, in the old days, the way people bought hearing aids is they would come into an audiologist's clinic, right? An audiologist, this is a trained, certified, professional in hearing loss. They would perform a test. They would get a prescription for a hearing aid or a hearing assist. The doctor, the audiologist, would recommend, here is the hearing aid for you. The person would buy it, they would pay for it, and they would leave the store. He said, now what's starting to happen is people come in, the audiologist does the test, gives them the prescription, says, this here, I think this model is the, the hearing aid for you. And increasingly, they said people are going, I don't know. I was reading the Google reviews on that hearing aid, and I actually understand like the battery life is a little bit weak on that model. Like, what about this one over here? I'm hearing some pretty good things on the forums that I'm looking at. It's not a one-way discussion anymore. That there is no sort of this hierarchy that like I'm the expert, I'm the audiologist. This is what you need. You just need to comply. It's a discussion. It's a debate. People want to collaboratively work with the partners in the companies that they are associated with. They don't want it to be a one-way street, which again, if you look back to those CEO skills, they need to be interacting with somebody who has human skills, collaborative skills, stuff that's a little bit more in that vein. And then, of course, the final thing that's going on, if we just kind of finish our trend scan of why disruption, why is evolution, more and more important, is I think the one that is most front and center for most of us when we're thinking about careers and thinking about skills is just the massive explosion of digitization and the rapid pace of change when it comes to computing power, to sensors, to artificial intelligence, right? We are facing, of course, this unprecedented boom of the rate at which technology is evolving and carving out human skills. Many of you probably saw the data from the IMF report that came out this week. Their estimate is that 40% of all jobs, all careers on Earth are going to be in some way impacted through the advent of AI. Personally, I think these people are just pulling round numbers out of the air. It's a little bit of an arms race of like who can give the biggest number in terms of impact. But I think there is no doubt that this stuff is going to have a pretty substantial impact on the way work is organized. And I think the framework that has helped me make sense of the impact that technology and AI is going to have on work, the thing that I have found most helpful is a framework that comes from one of our smartest Canadians, Roger Martin, who was the dean at Rotman for a number of years and often ranked the #1 management thinker in the world. And he came up with this idea that he called the knowledge funnel in one of his earlier books, The Design of Business. And the idea of the knowledge funnel is to help understand how is it that things go from being mysteries, that is, they are beyond human understanding, all the way to being so well understood that they can be written as code, right? That they can be automated completely. And so what Martin sort of articulated is everything starts out as a mystery, right? Everything starts out as a phenomena beyond human understanding. We don't understand why the weather changes, why it's sunny, then it's raining. We don't understand why people get sick, why some people get sick and other people stay healthy, right? All of these were at one point phenomena that were beyond our understanding. Then at some point, because human beings are great pattern recognition machines, that's one of the big functions that our brains have uniquely evolved to accomplish, we start to build heuristics. And heuristics are rules that help us make sense of and classify these mysteries, right? That allow us to make predictions, right? So I might start to notice that, hey, when the clouds look like this the night before, it's likely to rain the next day. When they look like this, even though it looks ominous, actually it tends to mean things are clearing up and it's likely to be sunny. Right? We start to notice that when two people go into the house of somebody who's sick, if one of them, bathes in the river afterwards, they're less likely to get sick than somebody who goes and starts to prepare food, right? We start to build these heuristics, these rules that help us make predictions and make sense of things. What's critical is when something is at the heuristic stage, it requires a knowledgeable interpreter to help people make sense of it. Right, so I need a meteorologist to help me interpret like the low pressure systems and the cloud formations. I need a physician to listen to the symptoms and give me a diagnosis. I need a lawyer to help me interpret, the body of case law and sort of make a recommendation on whether I should take this to trial or not. Right, all of these things require knowledgeable interpreters. But once we have hung out at the heuristic stage long enough, eventually we start to get these rules to the point where we can start to express them as algorithms, as equations. And from there, it's a pretty short jump to code. And if you think about everything that I just described, every one of those fields has made the leap to code, right? When I pull out my iPhone to check the weather, it is not phoning a meteorologist somewhere, right? It's using sensors and algorithms. You look at what was the bread and butter of lawyers for years, real estate transactions and wills. Well, those have moved to code. We are seeing pretty definitively that if you feed a list of symptoms into a machine learning model, it gives you a more accurate probability-weighted diagnostic or diagnosis than most physicians, right? This stuff is moving down this funnel way faster than ever before as technology becomes better and cheaper. And the critical thing for careers is that you do not want to be building a career that is based on applying heuristics in an industry that has moved to code. And I want to say that one more time. You don't want to be building a career that is based on getting paid to apply heuristics in an industry that is moving to code. This is one of the biggest disruptions, right? We're seeing it in wealth management with the rise of robo-advisors, healthy competition for wealth managers who apply heuristics in their day-to-day. So they're having to evolve their practices to be more than just that. We're seeing it in medicine. We're seeing it in law. We're seeing it in almost every domain. And so that's the landscape that I think we are operating in, right? We are facing biological and ecological disruption, which is forcing us all to adapt and evolve. Geopolitics is evolving. The way we relate to each other is evolving. And of course, we have to contend with the rising tide of all types of technology, generative AI included. And so the impact that this is having when it comes to careers, when it comes to organizations, is pretty profound. And I want to give you one, very tangible example of an organization that sort of went through this and is in the process of kind of dealing with it. And that is AT&T. Embedded in this profile from Fortune magazine on the 100 best companies to work for, embedded in this profile in AT&T was this remarkable stat that AT&T in 2013 did some internal research, and that research told them that 100,000 out of their 240,000 workers were in roles that the company probably wouldn't need in a decade. 100,000 out of 240,000 people in roles that would not be needed 10 years from now. And this is being driven off of all the stuff that we just talked about, right? AT&T, the thing that they foster is communication. Well, human norms around communication were changing greatly, right? We were moving from voice calls to texting to data to instant messaging. The whole world was migrating from analog to digital, from voice to data. They had a ton of mechanical engineers that were hired to maintain their legacy network of analog equipment. They need software engineers. They need coders. So if you are Randall Stevenson, right, if you are the CEO of AT&T and you get this piece of data, almost 50% of 250,000 people who work for you have skills that are going to be out of date 10 years from now. What do you do? What do you do with that information? Right? I think you have a couple of options. One is you do the organ transplant, right? You're like, okay, well, we don't need those 100,000 people, like out with them, and let's find the people that have the right skills. Most leaders, this is not the path that they want to take. First of all, it is incredibly expensive, right? From just a straight pragmatic point of view, to exit 100,000 people and go through the trouble to hire. You lose tons of organizational knowledge, but even beyond that, right? Most leaders in most organizations are good people. They don't come to work every day to fire tens of thousands of people. And so AT&T's mantra through this transition has been, we are taking the people. We are taking the people. And I think this is a very noble thing to say, and it is a very difficult thing to do. Because if we are going to transform an organization, but we're going to take the people, there's only one way that works, which is the people have to evolve. We need meta-skilled people that can make the journey with the organization. So let me make this even more practical, because of course, at the end of the day, coming out of this webinar, the goal is, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my career? And I want to use an example that I think will be far enough away that you can get some distance from it, but relatable to all of us. And that is the example of the pharmacist, right? I think everybody's familiar with a pharmacist. Most of us have been in a pharmacy over the past 6 months, I suspect. And if you look at the role of the pharmacist, right? If you think about pharmacists have been around since the 1300s. And if you look at the role of a pharmacist from the 1300s until about the year 2000, so 700 years, it was really predicated on 2 core skills: being good at chemistry and being good at math, right? Chemistry to compound the medication, math to count the pills and work out the cash register. Then, in around 2007, it depends on the jurisdiction, but in Ontario anyways, which is where I'm based, in around 2007, the government, who pays for all the drugs, said, we don't need to pay people 6 figures to count pills. Right? There are robots that can do that, like literally. They're called dispensing robots. They sit in the back of the pharmacy, they count the pills. Instead, what we want pharmacists to be doing is we want them to get out from behind the counter. We want them to talk to patients, right? We want them to be partners in healthcare service delivery. We want them to do vaccinations, diabetic counseling, celiac counseling, get out, educate people about services. And so almost overnight, the job of a pharmacist went from chemistry and math to being about customer service or even sales skills, while having the process savvy to run an automated process in the background. Now, you are talking about tens of thousands of people who went to school for chemistry degrees, right? Many of whom are hard introverts. They're going like, I like the counter, right? That's why I took this job. The counter, it separates me from the people. I don't want to get out from behind it and like have to sell people stuff and talk to people about stuff. It's a tough transition. And we know this is not going to be the last transition, right? Who knows, by 2030, this job could be about mental health counseling. It could be about personalized medicine, doing diagnostics on all the little nanobots that are supposedly going to be swimming in our blood and giving personalized data. It's about speaking and interfacing with AI, with large language models. So there are really 2 parts to this, which is, first, we all need to have clarity in our careers on what do we think, what is our best guess on the skills evolution that we are going to face. That's one piece of the puzzle. But the second thing is we got to think about this stuff, right? This is what I'm talking about when I use the words meta-skill. It's the connective tissue that allows somebody to let go of these old skills and make the leap to the new skills, and to do it over and over and over again, right? That's what meta-skills are about. So we're going to tackle each piece of this in turn, right? And I want us to start with the skills piece, because, I'm not saying skills are unimportant. Skills are what allow you to keep and have a job. So what are the skills that are going to be required? And I think this is a useful thing for each and every one of us to think about on a semi-regular basis, is within my field, within the career path that I'm in right now, whether that's marketing or it's finance or it's consulting, what are the skills that I needed historically? Like, what are the things that got me to where I am? What are the skills that I need to be staying on top of now because they anchor my current success? And then critically, when I kind of look out 1 or 2 years, 2 or 3 years, what do I think the skills are that are going to be essential to my success in the near future? Right? What are the things that are coming around the corner that are going to be useful for me in my industry and in my career? So that, I think, is job one from a career planning standpoint. Let's take care of the skills based on what you know about the industry, based on when you look at where things are going. What are some of the skills that are going to be useful? And by the way, one of the things that AT&T did really, really well, because of course we are now at almost the end of that 10-year span that they talked about, is they did this mapping for their employees. They actually provided information. They said, when we look out into the future of AT&T, here are the kinds of jobs and skills that are going to become more important, right? Software engineering, user experience, all that kind of stuff. And here are the kinds of jobs and skills that are going to become less important. They gave people information on what are the kinds of skills that you want to focus on developing if you're going to have a place or a future role in this transformed organization. So I think that's job one. The second job, though, is how do we work on strengthening this stuff? This is the stuff that makes us irreplaceable. And the thing that's useful about focusing on this connective tissue is that crystal balls are optional here, right? Because you may guess right or you may guess wrong on the future skills, right? This illustration is one of many from like the 1960s or the 1970s about what they thought the year 2000 was going to look like, right? We are comically bad as human beings at predicting the future. So you might be right, you might be wrong on the future skills. It's hard to say. What we can know for sure is that the future is going to be different and we're going to need to adapt. And so the meta skills, from my point, they're common currency or constant currency, right? We don't need to predict the future to know that being adaptable is going to have value. Now, at the same time, it is not particularly useful information to say to someone, and as I am saying to you now, like, you need to get better at evolving. Like, go work on that. Go get better. Go be more flexible. Go be more adaptable. Right? This is not particularly useful feedback. And in fact, when we teach coaching skills to leaders, to managers, which is how I spend a lot of our time, what we observe in the really good coaches is one of the things they're really good at is taking big, overwhelming end goals, like you need to get better at evolving, and break them down into what are the little piece parts, right? What are the things that I can learn, I can practice, I can master that are going to add up to this overall capability to evolve and adapt? And that's where we're going to go now, which is, what are those 6 meta skills? What are the 6 things that at the end of the day add up to this human capability to evolve, to be adaptable? And at a very high level, the meta skills kind of break down into 3 main categories. The first is my ability to see myself clearly. The second is my ability to move quickly. And the third is my ability to stay the course. So let's start with see clearly. This is where evolution starts. Evolution begins with my ability to build an accurate picture of my current abilities, my current limitations, and my current performance. And the reason this comes first is because at the end of the day, none of us, no adult human beings, we do not change because people tell us we need to change. We change because ultimately we build the self-awareness and self-responsibility that change is necessary, right? I change when eventually I decide that I need to change. So it has to start with awareness. Now, sometimes it is a little helpful to define something by looking at the opposite. And so I want to share a very short video clip that for me is the epitome of not seeing clearly. And so the video that I'm going to show, this is then CEO of Microsoft, Steve Ballmer. This is the CEO of Microsoft at the time getting interviewed right after Steve Jobs unveiled the first iPhone. So right after the first iPhone was announced. This is an interview with Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer. So have a listen.
Steve, let me ask you about the iPhone and the Zune, if I may. The Zune was getting some traction, then Steve Jobs goes to Macworld and he pulls out this iPhone. What was your first reaction when you saw that?
$500 fully subsidized with a plan? I said, that is the most expensive phone in the world. And it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine.
Whoops. right? This is the sound of about $1 trillion evaporating, right? You have to go back to this moment in time, right? Microsoft at this time had a 90% plus share of the desktop computing market, like 90+% of the market. What is their share of the mobile computing market? 0. Right? You know, they eventually launched Windows Phone. It was too late. They pulled the product. You know, the mobile computing market got divided up between Apple and Google. They missed the entire second wave of computing. Now, they've done a phenomenal job. Satya Nadella has done an unbelievable job of really getting back on track and building a business around AI and cognitive computing. But they went to from a 90+% share to a 0% share in the second age of computing. And by the way, for those of you that are students of business history, you can also notice the Nortel logo in the background here, which is a little bit of a 1-2 punch in this video when it comes to seeing things clearly. Right? When we don't see things clearly, that's when we fail to adapt. That's when we fail to evolve. And so for us as individuals, the 2 meta skills that at the end of the day allow us to see ourselves clearly are self-awareness and empathy. And I sort of see these as 2 sides of the same coin. Right? Self-awareness is my ability through introspection, through reflection, to uncover some of my blind spots, right? To get into that self-coaching mode where I go, you know, you did this well and you stumbled a little bit here, or you could improve this. Empathy is sort of the other side of the coin. Empathy, this is the meta skill that allows us to harvest the value from negative feedback, from difficult feedback. Because what empathy says is, hey, when somebody comes to me with information about myself that I don't like, that I might not want to hear, right? Do I get resentful? Do I try to push it away? Do I get angry? Or do I get empathetic and try to put myself in that person's shoes to understand where they're coming from? Right? When we cultivate empathy in the face of challenging information, when we go, I wonder why they're seeing me that way. What can I learn? That is a critical part of seeing ourselves more clearly, right? And this is what we train salespeople to do all the time, right? Hey, as a salesperson, if you get a complaint, like, don't push that away, dig in, right? That's where the gold is, right? When a customer is unhappy, that's where we find the insights. That's where we get the information to improve. And the same is true for us. Right, so that's sort of the 1-2 punch of seeing ourselves clearly is, am I cultivating self-awareness and am I building empathy that allows me to get information from others? Now, both of these are trainable skills. And at the end of the session today, I'm going to throw up a QR code so you can download all of this information, pretty much everything I'm saying today, including all of these tips on how to build the meta skills. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these tips because you have access to them at the end if you scan that code and download it. But for self-awareness, right, you can journal, you can engage in mindfulness meditation, you can, you know, build a practice of reading and sensing. For empathy, you can build a discipline of practicing curiosity. This is one that I do constantly. I read a book by a guy named Harry Beckwith a number of years ago, a book called Selling the Invisible. And he talked about how whenever he was out in conversation with somebody, he would actually write the words, "What if they're right?" on a little piece of paper, and he would fold it up and he would keep it tucked in the pocket in his jacket. And just remembering that that piece of paper was there, that allowed him to stay more curious in conversations. And as somebody who is quite opinionated and tends to express my opinions quite confidently, it's a really helpful cue for me to stay curious, to go, okay, well, what if they're right, right? What if I'm wrong? What if I'm missing something here? Second, right, you can practice reframing, choosing what's the frame I'm putting around this situation. And of course, the discipline of active listening is a wonderful way to build and demonstrate empathy and get more information from feedback. So that's seeing clearly. Then we get to moving quickly. And this, of course, you know, reflects the fact that, listen, awareness is great, but awareness without action is useful. I mean, to know and not to do, you know, is to not know. And so we have to be able to translate this awareness into new abilities. And I think one of the critical words on this page here is quickly, right? My ability to move with some pace. And pace matters in the kind of world that we're living in right now. If we want to stay relevant in our careers, we have to pick a few critical areas and try to get a little faster at evolving and moving. And one of the things that really landed this for me, the importance of pace, was is one of these, you know, sometimes in your career, you have these really these formative little conversations with key mentors. And this was a conversation I had with a senior partner at the Monitor Group, a guy named Bob Lurie. And he sat me down And he literally, we use the phrase back of a napkin, but this was literally drawn on the back of the napkin. He drew something for me that has stuck with me all these years. And this is what he drew. So let's imagine that as an organization, you are working at getting better at digital self-serve, right? And this is something that is happening in many, many industries, right? Financial services, we got people like Wealthsimple, restaurant reservations, we got OpenTable, even the government, through the CRA, registering a newborn for a social insurance number, that's all now digital self-serve, making it easy for people to solve their own problems. So let's imagine that you as a company, as an organization go, okay, we want to be the world leader in digital self-serve 5 years from now. So you go out and you do some benchmarking, and your benchmarking tells you, hey, if the world leader's at 100 or the market leader's at 100, we're currently at 80. We want to be number one by 2028. And you kind of look at that and you go, okay, right? 20-point gap to close, 5 years to close it. Hey, not too bad. Here is the challenge, though. What is the market leader doing for the next 5 years? They're improving, right? There's a reason that they are the market leader. So let's assume that they improve at 5% per year. Well, now, if you do the math here, I actually don't have a 20-point gap to close in 5 years. I have about a 47-point gap to close in 5 years. And what that means is that the slope of my line is actually twice as steep as the market leader. I actually need to improve 10% per year every year for 5 years. That is 100% faster than the current market leader every single year for 5 years just to close a 20-point gap. I want to say that again because the math here is kind of mind-blowing. To close a 20-point gap in performance in 5 years, I need to double the rate of improvement of the market leader every year for 5 years. This is the iPhone versus BlackBerry story, by the way. We talked about Microsoft and Apple, but BlackBerry versus iPhone. When the first iPhone came out, BlackBerry kind of quite rightly looked at it and was like, yeah, it's a little bit better. It does some things better. It's got a better screen, touch is a little bit better, but it doesn't have a keyboard. It doesn't have, our messaging service, BBM, which was dominant at the time. Well, then 6 months later, Apple launches the App Store. Okay, well, now it's a little bit more better. 6 months after that, they build in GPS and 3G. Okay, well, now it wasn't an initial starting point. It was a rate of change. The rate of change got away from them. They just couldn't catch up. And so if we are going to stay relevant, let's take this into our world now, we have to recognize that the rate at which we change, right, the rate at which we evolve to keep pace with this stuff is really essential. And first and foremost, that means focus. Like if you're trying to do 4 or 5 things at that rate, it's very hard. But second, we got to build the stuff that allows us to move quickly. And those are really the meta skills of I need the flexibility to sort of let go of the old skills that have anchored my success, which can be quite tough because those are often pride points for many of us. I need the creativity to sort of envision what could that next version of me look like. And then I need the raw learning capacity that's going to allow me to very quickly move up learning curves. And so again, these are all practical things that can be built. We can learn these, we can practice them, right? You can practice flexibility by introducing more discomfort into your life. This is the science behind cold plunges on the physical side. By practicing letting go, right? What are the things that you need to let go of? The conscious discipline. You can practice creativity. You can be really intensive of what are my goals for creativity. You can use your calendar to block time for creativity. One of the best resources I have seen on making time to be creative is the episode of the Tim Ferriss podcast with Jim Collins, who is the author who wrote Good to Great and Built to Last. He tries to carve out time and space for 2,500 hours of creativity every year. And he tracks it. He is disciplined. He blocks time in his calendar because he has realized that blocking time for creativity is the #1 thing that correlates to his success, right? To his ultimate sort of success in his field. And then, of course, you can get better at learning. You can involve others in learning. You can break up learning. There's also a wonderful course on Coursera called Learning How to Learn that goes through all of the theory on how do we level up our learning capacity, which is a really, really good resource. Final meta skill is our ability to stay the course. And this is to sort of persevere in the face of setbacks, to harness pressure to fuel growth. And the key meta skill here that we can build is resilience. And of course, the reason that this matters is the journey doesn't actually look like this. We wish the journey looked like this. The journey really looks a lot more like this. Anytime we are sort of moving from one version of ourselves to another version of ourselves, from one set of skills that have anchored our success and that we're confident and comfortable with, to being at the bottom of a learning curve and trying to learn a whole new set of skills, it's going to be herky-jerky, right? There's going to be pressure, there's going to be setbacks, there's going to be disappointment, there's going to be negative emotion. And so again, resilience is a buildable skill set, right? We can build, resilience by practicing environmental hygiene, being really careful on what we're letting into our environment in terms of stimulus, information, news, media. We can build resilience through physical means, sleep, nutrition, movement. We can build resilience through relationships and social support. And of course, we can build our resilience through the way that we look at the world, our inner skills. And this is something that I've written extensively about. So if you're interested, there's a lot of resources on resilience on our site, thirdfactor.com. So that's really the model, right? When we think about this, this ability to evolve. And remember, my fundamental thesis for this webinar is in the coming years, when it comes to career, evolution trumps execution. Not that execution is not important. I want to keep reiterating that. But evolution trumps execution in terms of longevity, right? In terms of being irreplaceable. And I think if we want to build those skills, it is about cultivating the self-awareness and empathy to see ourselves clearly. It's about flexibility, creativity, and learning capacity so we can move quickly. And it's about building the resilience to stay the course. So I am going to give us all sort of 30 seconds to think about, out of these 6 skills, self-awareness, empathy, flexibility, creativity, learning capacity, resilience, I want everybody on this webinar to pick the one muscle that if you were to strengthen it, that if you were to grow it, would give you the biggest bang for your buck, right? All of these you can develop. What's the one that would give you the biggest bang for your buck if you were to work on strengthening it in terms of your ability to be irreplaceable? And I'm going to do a quick straw poll because I'm always very, very fascinated. So you will see a poll that has just appeared on screen. Of course, there is no right answer, there is no wrong answer, but I'm always curious around distribution. The way to participate in this poll is you will see at the top of the slide the instructions to go to menti.com and the code. There's an 8-digit code. Once you land on menti.com, you can just pop in to participate. We're also going to just paste the link to the panel in the chat. And so that'll allow you to get there directly. If you just head into the chat, there's a link. And we'll be very curious on what is the one meta skill that you think you would get the biggest bang for your buck by focusing on. So I'll just give it a second as people get oriented here. Interesting. Okay. So, I mean, first observation, we've kind of covered the waterfront, which is very typical. There are people who kind of think each and every one of these are valuable to their future success. Sort of the biggest clusters, resilience and creativity. And I think certainly when you look at the past few years that we've all been through together, we have needed to be very resilient and very creative, but also learning capacity, sort of jumping up to the top of the heap as well. So again, whatever you picked, whichever one you want to prioritize, no right answer, no wrong answer, give it some time and attention. Look at some of the tips that you can grab at the end of the session and make this a part of your learning, right? Make a focus on this stuff, alongside some of the skills that you want to develop, some of the more technical stuff. So let me just exit out of the poll here. Okay. So the final thing, now that you've sort of set an intention for yourself, which I think is critical, right? What's the one that's going to allow you to be more adaptable, to foster your evolution, to make your career more irreplaceable? I want to speak to the leadership role that each and every one of us plays, because I know there will be many people on this webinar that formally lead people, and everybody else who influences others through their behavior. And I want to talk about how we build these meta skills in others. Right? Because it's one thing for us to focus on our own evolution, which is critical to our own career. And we want to work for organizations that are adaptable. We want to raise our kids to be adaptable. And I think there are a few things that we can do as leaders, as stewards of talent, to really, help the fostering of meta skills. The first is we want to be deliberate, right? In our organizations, at work, as leaders, I think it's important that we have a plan for both skill and meta skill development. because I often think the meta skill stuff, it kind of feels like it happens as a byproduct. I'll often go into organizations and you'll hear sort of the leader, it's been like, it's been a really tough 3 months, but I think, what you're really learning right now is resilience. And, I'm always sort of curious. It's like, okay, I must have missed when, we did the skill build around perspective and energy management and all the stuff that research tells us is correlated to resilience. I think this approach to building resilience, where it's like, we're just going to go through really tough times and that's going to build resilience. It always reminds me, there's a great cartoon, a great Calvin and Hobbes comic strip. And I don't know if we have any Calvin and Hobbes fans on the webinar, but one of my favorite genres of Calvin and Hobbes cartoons is, Calvin's dad makes a habit of explaining things to Calvin very, very poorly. And there's this one comic where Calvin's driving in the back seat with his dad and they go over a bridge. And Calvin goes to his dad. He says, Dad, how do they figure out the weight limits for these bridges? And his dad goes, well, Calvin, they build the bridge and then they just keep driving heavier and heavier trucks over the bridge. And eventually the bridge collapses. And so then they weigh the truck that made it across safely. And when they rebuild the bridge, that's what they post as the weight limit. And I often think this is kind of how we build resilience in organizations, right? We just keep driving heavier and heavier trucks over people, and eventually they give, and we're like, well, I guess we found out how resilient that person is, right? It's almost like this byproduct that we think it's going to build resilience. We think it's going to strengthen awareness. We've got to actually have a plan for this stuff. So of course, to go back to our metaphor here, we've got to have. If I'm running a pharmacy, I need a plan for the technical skills, for counseling, for nanotech. I also want to be asking myself, what's the plan here, right? How are we focusing on building meta skills? Second thing, we got to hit mindset head on. I think all of us, I'm sure by now, are familiar with this idea of growth versus fixed mindset. That things are, genetic and built, or, we can change, we can grow. The thing is, where people tend to have the most fixed mindsets are around the meta skills. Right? The majority of people think, they recognize they can learn the technical stuff. Like, you put me on a course, I can learn how to use Excel. I can learn how to, if I had to, I could learn Python. Like, I can learn some of the technical stuff. It's the meta skill stuff. They go, I'm just not flexible, right? I've been told since kindergarten I'm not flexible. It's just not who I am. Or there is a whole class of people who, as adults, they go, I'm not a creative person. And why do they say they're not creative? They go, I can't draw. I can't draw, right? Like there is some correlation between how well you can draw a horse and how creative you are, right? These are not sort of related things. And so one of the things is a great book called Creative Confidence by the guys who founded IDEO. One of the things they show is once you bust that mindset and you show people, hey, if you can draw, lines and shapes, you can convey action, you can convey emotion, you can convey relation. When you bust the mindset that like, I can't draw, that's when the creativity starts to come. So I do think there has to be some mindset work, and that's both for us and also for others. And then the final thing is we have to think about the role of leadership, right? Which is, at the end of the day, if we are going to ask people to go through this messy journey of personal evolution and development, we need to arm leaders to not just be drivers of results, but producers of growth. And in my world, I call these coaching skills, right? We need to help leaders be really good coaches, because that journey up that learning curve, it's painful. Right? It's up and down, it's back and forth. We need people that aren't judging at every step, but are instead getting curious and developmental, as people encounter some of those setbacks. So that's it. I know I say that's it. We covered a lot of ground. The thing that I would leave you with is you can work on these, you can build them, you can develop them. And if you focus on this is, what leads to being irreplaceable, this ability to adapt and to grow. So with that, would love to do some Q&A. I'm going to throw the QR code I mentioned up just while we start the Q&A. I'll put my face in the corner as well, but I did sort of tease some resources. So if you want access to those and you need to drop a little bit early, there's the QR code to download some of the tips. That will also get you 3 nudges at 30, 60, 90 days, one on See Clearly, one on Move Quickly, one on Stay the Course. So just a whole bunch of resources, of course, only if you want access to them, but those are there for you. But with that, would love to see what came in. Turn it over to the Q&A.
Thank you, Dane. Sorry for popping on too early. I was excited
No, it's great.
to get to the questions. And gosh, audience, you were so fantastic and engaged in the chat. I saw lots of people being very enthusiastic about this presentation, Dane, and I know a lot of people are feeling charged up and ready to go. We've got some good questions. Can I just quickly ask this question on behalf of Daniel? What was the name of the author that Tim Ferriss interviewed in his podcast that you mentioned quite quickly?
Jim Collins.
Jim Collins. Daniel, did you get that? Okay, we're going to go with yes. A question from Gregory. Dane, inspiring presentation, many thanks. Would be interested in your take on Gen AI and how one ought to incorporate into one's career planning. Seems like a lot of buzz, hype, and blather. What's your advice?
Buzz, hype, and blather is a great name for a book, actually. I like that. I like that, Greg.
Gregory gets a cut, though, okay?
Yeah, oh yeah, fair enough. All right, there's a royalty there for you, Gregory. So I just had it's funny, I just had a beer last night with a close friend of mine who is on the advisory council for the digital supercluster at West, and they are working to build a competency model for AI for organizations. And the number one thing that he wanted to impress on me through our conversation was organizations really need to start with building the capability to identify what are the use cases for AI in their organization. Like, what are the problems that AI can solve, as opposed to just buying everybody a ChatGPT subscription and assuming that that's going to make people more productive. And I think this is like what we've been learning about innovation for the last 40 years is you can't just give people new technology and expect that they're going to figure out some great way to use it. You have to start with what are the things that AI could make smoother, better, stronger, faster, cheaper in this organization? And then let's go with that insight. Start with the insight of where's the use case, what's the job to be done, and then let's go figure out what's the right tool to do it. So one example that he's working on is faster time to market for commercial communications from pharma companies. Communications from pharma companies are subject to tons of regulation, tons of legal oversight. Well, guess what? It's really good. Gen AI is really, you can feed all the rules, the regulations by district, by geography, and an AI model can do a really good job of doing a regulatory scan, a brand compliance scan, and lower time to market to get a commercial message out for a pharma company. Okay, now we actually have a use case, and we can go and figure out what's the AI tool that's going to allow us to realize that value. In our line of work, one of the things that we're working on is we think there's a real AI use case for a feedback coach. Right. So, I've got to give a piece of feedback to somebody who is a direct report that I have a good relationship with. We load in all of our principles for really good feedback. It can help coach somebody on that in a way that a peer might be able to do a good job coaching them. So I think my number one thing is, get really good at starting with a hypothesis, starting with a use case, instead of going tool out and just assuming that this is going to supercharge a whole bunch of stuff.
Right. Wow. Okay, that was great feedback. Thank you. I've got Claire asking, do you consider meta skills the same as durable or soft skills? Are they something that's a little bit different?
That's a great question. So I'm not someone who has like an allergic reaction to soft skills. I know that's a very polarizing term where people are like, these are power skills. They're like, and maybe I'm just generally not a big like hardliner on taxonomy. I think the way that I would describe it, I think soft skills probably encompass meta skills, but that meta skills for me anyways are a bit of a subset of soft skills, because I would see soft skills including things like your communication skills, your emotional intelligence, your ability to read a room, and meta skills for me are much more tied specifically to the ability to let go of and acquire new skills, versus my ability to lead, to inspire, to communicate effectively. So yeah, I would say they're probably a sub. Now, by the way, there is crossover, right? Being more empathetic, yes, it helps me evolve. It also helps me relate to other people. Being more creative, it helps me evolve, but it also helps me inspire. So there's probably a bit of a Venn diagram there, and how they're related to each other.
But just to clarify, when people are out in the world talking about meta skills, is meta skills a term now broadly understood, or is that a term that you guys use in your organization to describe those skills?
I think it's more the latter. Yeah, I don't think it's a broadly understood term that everybody would have the same. But hey, we could, maybe we can make it that.
But just so
We
we're
got.
clear, when people go blazing out into the world and
That's
say
right.
their boss, I'm here to, improve my meta skills, and the boss says, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, what the hell are meta skills?
That's where our audience gets to do a bit of teaching. And remember, we've
That's
got
right.
2 weeks with the video recording. So
Exactly.
okay, good. And some people are asking some quite specific ways that they might weight. Somebody says, is there a weightage that can be applied to these meta skills so we can focus in an order? I mean, you had said pick the one that you think you need to work on. Is there one? I was curious when I was listening. Is there one that you have found in your own coaching that shows up as kind of a blind spot for people? Or is it?
I think if you have to start somewhere, self-awareness. For sure. I mean, there's a lot of really strong research that shows that self-awareness is the single biggest predictor of executive success. Self-awareness is kind of like the meta skill, because until I am aware enough to know, like, oh, actually, I could be more empathetic, or actually, you know what, I think my lack of flexibility might be a block. Like, it's the one that sort of allows you to understand how are all the other ones sort of playing out. So I think if you have to pick one to start with, that's the one where I would sort of lean in first. Now there are other cases where, like, you may need to start with resilience because you're just in survival mode, and the thought of trying to evolve, it's like, oh my gosh, like I'm barely keeping my head above water just trying to like execute what I've got on my plate right now. Like I'm supposed to be creative, and like, so I do think there are other, and then it becomes just this additional stressor of like, oh my gosh, I'm not evolving fast enough.
I'm not self-aware enough. Like
right,
that.
exactly. So again, I don't think there is one to rule them all, but I do think self-awareness is usually a pretty safe starting point. Yeah.
I suspect that would just make you a better human all around.
Yes, agreed. Yeah.
All right, good. Last question we're going to take from Sarah Indaway. Any additional podcast or newsletter recommendations on this topic? Anything you want to point people to in terms of like further developing themselves? Or are there just generally things you really enjoy that you want to just leave us with?
Yeah, I think there's what are a couple of resources that are useful. So certainly, like on the specific meta skills, I will say learning how to learn for learning capacity is really, really good. On the resilience front, I'm a little bit biased, but there's a bunch of great content on the Third Factor website, which you can look at if you're interested in resilience. On the empathy side, there's a great book called The 4 Factors of Trust by Amelia Dunlop and Ashley Reicheld, which I really like. And then just general sort of information sources on this stuff. I name checked the Tim Ferriss podcast. I think especially the earlier stuff, he's kind of gone a little more into like psychedelic treatments for depression and stuff which is important, don't get me wrong, but related to this stuff, sort of the earlier episodes where he was, interviewing people like Jim Collins and productivity authors and stuff. There's a lot of good content in those first couple of seasons. And then just like, I think books that a lot of people are probably already pretty keyed in on right now. Tasha Eurich's work on self-awareness is really good. The creativity book I name-checked was Creative Confidence by David and Tom Kelly. That's a really nice read. So those are probably a few places to start. That's
All
right.
right. This is where I get to do a little wee bit of housekeeping. I always want to let people know that in terms of developing skills, there's nothing better than we always say than Queen's Executive Education. So coming up at the end of February is our flagship 5-day leadership program. It's going to be taking place in person at the Donald Gordon Conference Center in Kingston, which is always fun because they have these unlimited candy machines. So consider that. It runs again in June, so it's 5 days in person. More information is available online at smithqueens.com/execed. And then I do want to let our audience know our next free webinar is going to be in honor of Black Histories and Futures Month, and we hope you'll be able to join us for that one. It's going to be called The Path to Leadership, and it will feature a panel of Black business leaders discussing their own career journeys and sharing lots of advice. I'll be in the audience for that session. I won't be hosting. Your special guest host will be Aziz Garuba, host of the podcast Made to Lead, and I know it'll be a fantastic session, so keep your eyes on your inbox for more information on that session and to share it with your people in your network. Dane, don't go away. You've gone away.
I'm here.
My chance to thank you on behalf of our audience, on behalf of Queen's University and Smith School of Business. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's always a pleasure. We learn so much from you, and it's really fantastic. You'll see the comments. People are going crazy with their thanks. So,
Well, it's awesome. Yeah,
thanks a lot.
Thank you, Meredith.
Enjoy the afternoon, everyone.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thanks again.